Good morning, good day, and good evening. Welcome to episode, I want to say, 185 of Tech of a T. I'm, as always, your host, Brody Robertson, and today we have a very special guest. Welcome to the show, Daniel Stenberg, who also happens to be, alongside the developer of curl, the first guest on this show that has a Wikipedia page. How you doing? Welcome.
Ooh, hi.
It's a
Hi,
it's,
good to be here.
it's a very short Wikipedia page. It's like one paragraph long, but there is a Wikipedia page.
Yeah, I think it's actually longer in a few other languages because
Ah,
actually, I think it
right.
started in Swedish actually because I
Oh,
got
that makes sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
got a prize in 2017 and I think someone made a page back then.
Yeah, why did the overlay break? Good start, good start. Here we go. We'll fix that up just right now. Yeah, I think the English one is, sorry, it's 4 paragraphs long. Either way, it's more Wikipedia than I have, that's for sure. The picture they have there is in every picture I've seen taken of you, you are staring like dead straight at the camera. It's slightly unnerving, but it's kind of your thing from what I can see. Like the
I guess so, yeah.
like I don't know what it is, but there's something about looking right down the lens that's just I don't know. I don't know, but we're not going to focus on that. Before we get into like the actual important stuff about curl, there is one thing I did want to ask you about. What's the deal with Badger? Why is that like the handle you use in a lot of places?
Well, it's actually the misspelled version, so it's Bagder, not the
Wait,
animal.
I didn't even. Wait, is it? Wait.
Exactly, yeah, and that's a common reaction too because I actually it's a long time coming because I back in the mid 80s um, I was playing around with the Commodore 64
Mhm,
and we created demos in it. We made a little demo team, me, my brother, and a friend, and we
mhm.
started to make. And everyone had handles back then in demo groups and everything. So I needed one too. So I just figured it out, and I wanted it to be the animal, but I misspelled it immediately. That's sort of my thing. So and then but I realized it pretty soon. But then I
Right.
figured, well, it makes it a little bit more unique and special. But of course, that has the side effect that then everyone first reads it as Badger in their head, and then I have to read. So it's sort of a reverse typo then, or whatever it is.
Well, it also makes it a handle that's actually possible to get. Like, obviously, you have. Actually, no, you're on Mastodon Social. I thought you actually had your own
Yeah,
server. But on. Like, if it was actually Badger, getting that handle anywhere would be basically impossible.
exactly. Now at least I have a small chance now at least to have it
Hmm.
because it's more unique than the animal. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, sure. Anyway, curl. Yeah, curl. So
Yes.
that's the project you're most known for. I'm sure most people in the Linux world have made use of curl in some form or another, and on other operating systems because there was the whole Windows thing where people were deleting curl and then trying to update it, which was a fun time to talk about. We might talk about that as well, but just for anyone who doesn't know, briefly explain what curl is.
Well, so curl is curl is the project, and in the curl project we actually make two products really.
Okay.
We make a command line tool called curl, and we make a library that's called libcurl. So libcurl is the library that the curl command line
Mhm.
tool is using then to do internet transfers really,
Right.
to or from a URL basically. So you can most users are then used to downloading a web page or something on the
Mhm.
command line, curl and URL, and it'll download it and
Mhm.
spew it on the terminal if you don't have any other options. But it also then it speaks. I think we now count 28 different protocols. It makes uploads, downloads. It speaks, countless different protocols and variations, TLS versions, flavors. So it's really a machine with a lot of different protocol tweaks
Mhm.
and abilities in different combinations to basically do internet transfers uh, in pretty much any shape or way you think you want it.
Mhm. Mhm. So right now, I'm not going to read the entire list, but notable ones are FTP, Gopher, HTTP, HTTPS, IMAP, SCP, SMTP, SMTPS, Telnet, and a bunch of others. If you want to read it, go to the curl website. It's probably the easiest way to find it. Is that list up to date, or is there other things it does support?
No, I think it's up to date.
Okay.
Sometimes I go through that and make sure that it actually reflects my opinion of it. So yeah. So yes, it is. Actually, the most recent ones I'm working with is the WebSocket support, and they'll count them as two different ones. So the WS and WSS in URL scheme.
Okay.
Terms.
So when curl first started, like, okay, why did you make curl in the first place? Like, what didn't other tools achieve at the time, or were there other tools that were achieving the job that was even close to what you wanted curl to do?
There were other tools around, of course. I mean, there were always tools, but sure. It started, of course, before I named it curl, actually, because it started already in the 1996 when I wanted a tool to just download HTTP data every once in a while, because I wanted to download currency rates for my IRC bot. But so I wanted a little tool to download HTTP. How do you do that? I had no idea how HTTP worked, so I just looked around for a tool that did that for me, and I found one that was so I started with a tool called wget. That was released in November 1996. That was around 160 lines of code. It downloaded HTTP. Fine, that's what I wanted. But of course, it has some bugs and some tweaks to do. So I sent back some patches. It was written by a Brazilian developer, and I started to send him small patches to improve it. It's still tiny, right? So, but that's how I got into it. I learned how the HTTP. It's pretty easy. At least it was easy back then, or I thought it was easy, and it was easy to get started or tricked into believing it was easy. So that's what I have. And Rafael, then the developer of it, he sort of grew bored with me pretty quickly, me sending him patches, because I think he didn't really want to he didn't want to do much other than, throw it out the door. Here's something for everyone to do. Right. I don't want to maintain this. You can take over. So I took over the maintenance of that tool I think I started in late 1996 with that HTTP GET tool. And I played with that for a while until I found a Gopher site to download currency rates from as well. So I added Gopher support, and then HTTP GET was a stupid name.
Right.
So we renamed it to URL GET, and I already back then I started to get some other patches from other people too. So it wasn't just me already from those early days. So we started to do some other URL GET releases, and one day we had a support for FTP, and because I found more currencies, I was a lot into currency rates. So I added FTP, and then after a while we added support for uploads as well, and that then URL GET became a really silly name because it wasn't only GET. There were URLs, but not only GET. So what should we call it? And also at the time, I realized that URL GET was too much of a sort of ordinary name, that there were also a lot of other URL GET tools, right? So how would you know which URL GET you were talking about? So it was just a too simple name to use. So combine there. So let's call it curl. So by the time I called it curl in 1998, in March 1998, it was already 2,000 lines of code. It did those 3 protocols. It had 24 command line options. So sort of that was the embryo. It was already a little command line tool that could do a lot of transfers.
So at that point, there wasn't a libcurl. There was just the command line tool.
Exactly. It started with a command line tool. So and after a while, actually, so I managed to get that going, got patches back, people started to use it. And after a while, I always had that in the back of my mind that this could become a cool library, because it's a lot of powers in being able to do good internet transfers. So I sort of figured or suspected that others might want that feature, sort of that power too, into their applications. And everyone doesn't want to rewrite their own HTTP code. So I turned that into a library in the year 2000 in the summertime.
Okay.
So from 2000, I shipped libcurl. I sort of rewrote curl the tool to use the library. So that was a sort of a big shift internally. But since then, we have them both. And I've always kept shipping them both as in the same package, so the same. So they're sort of bundled when I ship the code, but they're separate. So you can use just the library if you want to.
So in a sense, maybe this wasn't your intention, but in a sense, the curl command line tool now acts as kind of a reference use case of the library.
Yeah, exactly. More like a binding for the shell,
Mm-hmm.
or sort of to access the library.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually also a very good way for me. So I often tend to, when I implement something in the library, it's good to implement it to make it available in the command line tool as well, because it makes testing easier and access to that feature much easier. So it's much easier to develop it when I can use it from the tool rather than just have it in the library.
So when you're saying you renamed the project to curl, you kind of skipped over like what curl actually meant. Like, why was that the name that you went with?
Yeah. So URLget being still a name, so I had to have a different name, and I liked that I wanted it to be sort of a URL in the name because it works with URL, and it still does that. So I wanted something with URL in the name. So what do you, and you know, naming is really hard. What do you name something? So for me, it just struck me that, well, curl, that's an English word, you can pronounce it, and the C could be for client maybe. I also enjoyed that you could actually say it like see URL. You could actually see the URL, sort of type it out, you know, in the terminal. So, I mean, that was all I needed. So, and it was short. So you know, command line style. I'm a command line user, so I wanted it to be short, sort of in the Unix tradition. So short, pronounceable, includes URL. That's all I needed. So I went with that.
Well, yeah, you could have gone with what like a bunch of other projects from the time were, which is either you name it after the place it was made or you name it after yourself. Like there's a ton of early distros.
Yeah, I could have done that, but yeah. But you know, naming is really hard. So what do you call something? I actually think I ended up with something pretty decent. So I was happy with that. So it's
like if you look at things good. Like the first generally considered Linux distro like MCC Interim Linux, which is just Manchester Computing Center, or then there's other distros like TAMU, which is Texas A&M University. Like that's just it's just the entire name. Like naming, especially naming, and you're trying to keep it short. If you're just trying to give it some sort of name, like that's obviously difficult as well. But if you want to make it so it's still easy to use in a command line context, like that's getting something short and easy to remember, especially with how few good options there are available in that like 1 to 6 character mark is going to be quite difficult.
Yeah. And if you want it pronounceable too, so it's also sort of limits it. So yes, it was it's hard, but it worked like that. And then when I tell you about sort of this early journey, then people mention wget, because wget also downloads HTTP, right?
Yes.
And wget actually existed before that. The first version of wget was released earlier in the year 1996. So they actually, I think they were like half a year before me or something.
January 1996, it says on Wikipedia.
Yeah, so but I didn't know about them. I didn't find. I guess also that by the time, you know, when I wanted that first little thing to just download currency rates, I just wanted something dead simple. So I guess that if I had found wget at that time, I would probably have ditched that anyway, because I wanted something much smaller and simpler, not knowing exactly how things work. So, but I didn't. So it took, I don't know when I realized that wget existed. It was at least a long time afterwards. And by the time I understood it, I sort of thought of the differences to be bigger than just, you know, ditching my project and going with that, because already when I understood that wget existed, we were different projects and we had different mindsets and different ideas how to do things. We have an overlap, so sure, both tools can download stuff, but otherwise I think they differ in so many different ways, so they actually are sort of, they make sense to be two different separate projects.
So what do you see as the advantages of your project over something like wget?
Well, I think if I really shouldn't say what wget does or what's their primary, but wget, for example, is very good at, you know, downloading stuff recursively, for example, because it knows how to parse HTML and CSS and stuff like that to find everything. Curl has nothing of that. It doesn't understand content at all. So if you download HTML, sure, it can download HTML, but it doesn't know what HTML is, so it can't find any links or images or anything. So there's no recursive ability and stuff like that. So that's one of the primary things. And that's one of the things I've always tried to maintain in curl. Curl never understands the content, neither upload, download. It's just a transfer machine. It doesn't know anything about what it transfers.
Right.
So I always wanted curl to be sort of specific just for the transfer up or down, and basic transfers from the beginning, and then you add the fancy stuff with options, so that you can craft it exactly how you want the transfer to be done. And it's sort of, it's there, it does the transfer, and then you customize it accordingly, however you want to change it. That also makes it pretty it also makes it a good way to, how it works, and it remains working like that. Even if we add new features, we rarely add them by default, right? So it pretty much works the same way as it did last year, but now the next year, maybe you can add some new options to make it do other things to improve that or change that.
I would imagine not focusing on the content of the pages also makes it a lot easier to sort of add in new protocols and then not have to worry about, like, how do I handle the specific kind of data being transferred over that protocol, which would make it a lot more, it would add a lot more maintenance burden if you were really worrying about, like, okay, so we have HTML here, we have markdown files from this protocol, we have these files and these files. It's going to add a lot of extra work that just being like, okay, it doesn't matter what the protocol is, we download, we upload from it, and that's pretty much as far as the important relationship ends.
Yeah, and I think that is perhaps most notable when you do email protocols with curl. Like if you download IMAP or you upload SMTP, because I want to see them as download upload, right? You don't read emails, you download emails, you don't send emails, your upload data to SMTP. That curl doesn't know anything about the contents, right? It doesn't know email protocols. So if you want to send an email with curl, right, because it can speak SMTP, but it has it doesn't format the content for you. So you have to sort of, you have to write the entire content correctly and then use curl to send it. And that way you can do it, but curl doesn't know about it. So yeah, and I think for me, it has been it has helped me all the way to keep the focus really on what curl is and what it isn't. I mean, it's still grown ridiculously much anyway, but at least, you have to have the line in the sand somewhere. This is curl, this is not curl. So it's good to have that in some ways, at least, to know that no, now you're talking about content. Content is for someone else. So you create the content, you use curl to send the content or receive the content.
So you're focusing on this singular use case rather than trying to expand out to be, I guess, an entire, I don't know how you'd really describe it if you did expand out, like an entire protocol consumption and, like, yeah, like, you know what I'm trying to get? Like, if you did try to, if you don't have that line in the sand, you're going to end up massively increasing the scope of the project and sort of losing this idea of just, we're trying to obtain and post content.
Exactly. So and sure, I mean, that could possibly have been possible, but I think also then we would have easily have grown the scope just immensely, and someone would have to do that work, and we would easily have wandered off in one direction. That certainly is not where we are today. So no, I'm pretty happy with sticking to that. So basically, we have a few rules, but basically what is curl, and that is, we don't know about content is one of the things, and it's supposed to be upload or download. So no real sessions,
right.
Or we support telnet, but that's the sort of an we shouldn't. one of those things we probably should never aim.
How did telnet get in there then? Like, what's the, is there a story
it was
there?
One of those early ones. I think I was a little bit too happy to just add another protocol.
Right.
Sure, it's another protocol, we can do it. But looking back at it, I think that was the wrong decision. But hey, that was 20 years ago. So and then I want the protocol to be you need to be able to specify it with a URL, and with a URL that have at least some attempt of being a real syntax. So I mean, not made up by just a guy in the cellar somewhere, but some attempt to make it a standard. Ideally a standard, but at least so, because URLs are supposed to be interoperable, right? It's not supposed to be just one tool. So as long as you sort of fulfill all those conditions, then it could be a curl protocol.
Well, by keeping this focus, it also adds in this possibility for someone to take what curl is as this upload and download tool and then build upon that, build some sort of extension to the tooling that then does understand the content, rather than you trying to do that yourself and sort of getting in the way of other projects that might have different approaches for handling that content. Like, you just focus on your one thing, and then if someone wants to be like, okay, we're going to use curl to absorb HTML content and then parse it in this certain way and display it in this certain way, like, that's up to them to go and do.
Yeah. So exactly. So that is really the intention. So we provide the engine that gets and sends the data for you, and you manage the data in however you want it. And that has turned out to be really effective and a good way, sort of a good layer to be in. So most people don't want to implement their own data transfer engine. It's good enough if they can just get someone else's. And getting data up and down, and I mean, I have to say that curl also came in a pretty good time, or it was good in time that at the same time when sort of the internet use exploded, and internet and protocols and everything, so curl could take off with the entire explosion. I mean, who knew back in 1990s that we would have, any device we ever own from now on will have internet access, cars, printers, fridges, whatever. They didn't have that back then. We had a single computer somewhere that had perhaps internet access every now and then when we dialed up.
So when you were first getting started, I know that you said wget already existed, but what other tools did exist at the time that maybe don't exist now, that maybe you'd looked at when you were thinking of, doing this stuff with curl? Like,
well, HTTP wise, there weren't many tools. So networking wise, that was sort of just at the end of the Gopher era, and a lot of people then used when you automated downloads, you often used the FTP command line tool, right? And that was always a bit of a problem to do automated downloads with FTP tool, because you had to sort of pipe in the commands and hope that it works. So that was the kind of tools we had back then. Very quirky, and they were not at all good to do, like, in a cron job to download everything, something every week or day or something. So it was not that many different options. So downloading, for example, then an HTTP URL. As I said, I didn't find any other tool than this. So it was the early days. And then as I was developing this, I, of course, then stumbled over others in those, simple early stages that I was in then. So other people did HTTP GET tools and URL GET tools in those early days.
But there wasn't really anything sort of really established just yet. It was just a lot of people trying out different things.
Exactly. So there were just a plethora of tiny ones that appeared and vanished. So, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So, actually, where are we going from there? So, I just got sidetracked. So we talked about where curl. Okay, so as you were developing curl, like, what have you found to be some of the biggest challenges you found along the way?
Oh, the biggest challenges.
I'm sure that's a very broad
there are many
question.
challenges. So we've been around for a while, right? We turned the curl itself turned 25 earlier this year. So we've suddenly been doing this for a long time. Now, I think one of the, of course, the early lessons that has always been with us ever since is, of course, that speaking protocols like HTTP, there are protocols, they're defined in standards somewhere. You can read the specs and it's there, but it never actually works exactly that way. So one of the lessons is that you really need a long time, and you really need to just run it with different servers, different use cases, and everywhere across the internet to figure out exactly how strict can you be following the standards, when do you have to be lenient, or when is the standard just maybe a guide, or when sometimes you have to do the opposite just because you want it to work in a specific way. And then along the way, then when the browsers do things, for example, and then suddenly we realize that if the browsers do things in one way, the spec says something another way, and curl does it the third way. So which one is the right way? We always have to deal with that. So I think that's a constant battle we do or have. Usually we try to go, often we go with the way the browsers do, but because often users want to be able to mimic browser operations with curl. So if they do things a certain way, then we usually go roughly the same way. So that's one of the things that we've of course learned along the way, and that's one of the reasons why it takes a long time to get the internet transfer tool or code to actually become good, because you have to have a lot of time and to be able to polish the rough corners everywhere and understand how things actually should work, apart from what its standards say.
Do you have an example of browsers doing things differently than what the spec would expect to be the case?
Oh, yes. So I worked for Mozilla for a while, right? So
Okay.
I worked a lot of the HTTP implementation in Firefox. And one of the, for example, just maybe an easy but perhaps a little bit sort of internal detail is when you speak HTTP 1, it's a text-based protocol, right? So there's you send a request and there's some text-based headers that comes before the content in both directions. So when you send a request, you send, I want to get this path, here are some headers, and then the body comes, and then the response comes with some headers, and then the response. And for example, when you get an HTTP response from a server, there are different ways for the server to tell you how big this response is,
Right.
how much data is following the headers here, 2 bytes, 100 bytes, or it can all. So how do you know how big it is? Well, there's this standard header called content length. Pretty straightforward, right? It says how big the response is. What happens if the response has a different size than what's in there?
Okay.
Well, first, how do you know it's different? Because you're supposed to judge, if it says 12, right? Then you know that it's 12 bytes. You just read 12 bytes of the network and then you're done. But you can't do that because there are enough number of servers out there that will say the wrong number, right? And deliver something less or something more. And that is one of those ways where it takes a long time until you realize that. And when you realize that's sort of okay, but that's just wrong. The server is just wrong, right? So you just return an error then because the server is wrong. But that's not how you do it in browser land, right? You never say the server is wrong. You try to do the best out of the situation. And basically, the browser never says the server is wrong. It just, okay, it delivered 11 bytes. So let's try to show those 11 bytes as a web page somehow, even if it said it was going to deliver 12 or something in that style. And that's one thing. In curl, we usually don't have to be that lenient when it comes to that particular validation, but it's in that vein that sometimes, for example, browsers have a completely different motivation for doing things. They really, really go very hard on displaying something to a user rather than showing an error. While in curl, we many times actually rather have the error so that the user have a sort of understanding what's going on and can take precautions, maybe do the request again or something like that. So, and that also makes it really, really hard to make those decisions. What's the right choice here? The spec says one thing. A lot of users then see that, well, when I use this tool, it does this. It's completely different. So yeah, those things can be really hard. And there are, of course, countless of examples when you really dig into those details. It's supposed to do this, but 1 out of 25 servers do this. What do you do then? Do you call it an error or do you not call it an error? Yeah.
So it's sort of about judging the user expectation there, and sort of the way people are going to be using the tool.
Yes, and sort of balancing just for, I mean, you cannot sort of sacrifice security, for example, just because the users might get a better experience. Then you have to sort of put your foot down. So it's sometimes a tricky balance. What's the right choice here? Like, for example, this silly thing, checking the certificate in a TLS from a server says, of course, sometimes it's wrong. You can't just say that continue anyway, because that's completely insecure. You just have to say fail. There's something wrong with the certificate, even if the user sometimes says, well, I don't care about it. I just want the data. So there's a lot of that. So it's hard sometimes to know which way is the correct way forward. So you have to sort of try different things and I think, of course, listen in what users say. What is the right way forward? Understand the protocols, see what others are doing, and yeah.
And I would assume in certain cases, it would also make sense to include like an override to have both options available. Where,
Yeah.
like obviously, if it's like really important security stuff, maybe not. But if it's maybe the option of downloading like a broken web page or putting an error, like maybe you want the option to download that data anyway.
Exactly. So that's sort of, that opens up for this sort of option explosion, because suddenly it comes up. So no, most users wanted to do this, but there are always these exceptions. But I have this broken thing that I really want to download from. How do I do that? So no, then you have to add an option for override this check for these kind of stupid servers. So you add that option, and then someone comes up with a different broken server that they also want to download from, and add and add and add, and suddenly you have 24 of those options that add sort of flags for different weird or broken crap. But they're all there, and there are users of them. So yes, and that's actually an explanation also why then the number of options, command line options to curl, really has taken off like crazy since then.
How much are you at now, if you know the number off the top of your head?
257 since a few days ago. So 24 in March 1998. 257 now.
I don't even know what half of these options do. I'm sure they've all got a use case for somebody, but
yes,
yeah, I probably use 3 of the options at most.
Right. Well, some of them suffer a little bit by our decision to not break existing use cases. So we introduce them once and we don't remove them again. So some of them were perhaps a little bit prematurely or stupidly added, in 2004. Maybe we didn't really anticipate this to survive forever. So maybe if, look back at them, maybe we should have designed them differently if we would have done it again. But
right.
Too late now. So we add a new one. So that's the better one, right? So forget about them. We don't use that, but it's still there because we still have to. So it suffers a little bit of that. So maybe we could have removed 20 of them if we wouldn't have, want them to still work. So it's a little bit of that. And then there's a lot of exactly what you talked about, adding different things for different use cases. So basically one wants this, but we don't do that normally. And we add stuff all the time. And over time, when we add, there's also this combination explosion in protocols and ability to do things. So, and then you have to have a lot of different options just to control what to do when you add different layers and protocols of different versions and blah, blah, blah. So this really, the number of combinations is, of course, I don't know. I can't even count it, but it's ridiculous, right? And a number of combinations in options, and then numbering combinations of what kind of protocols that are actually then used over the wire. It's you can do a lot.
So is this not wanting to break previous use cases the reason why, even though you don't think Telnet should have been added, it's still there at this stage?
Yes. Right. Yeah. That plus sort of there's not a big of a gain to remove it. I get that question quite a lot when I say, sure, it supports Gopher too. And they say, Gopher, isn't that sort of, why do you have that around? But in most cases...
If you go into like the Linux YouTube space, there's like 5 people that talk about Gopher all the time.
Exactly. But there's also that usually those tiny edge case protocols, they're very easy to just keep around. There's not many users, so we don't get a lot of problems with them. There's not a lot of development. There's not a lot of friction. So they basically, they sit there over there in the corner. Nobody had looked at them for the last year. It's not a big problem for us. So usually it's why remove that? That's just more work to remove them than just leave them in the corner. Don't bother them. It's the big protocols that everyone is using. Those are the ones that get all the attention, get the problems, get the development, and all the time.
So outside of HTTP, what are the protocols you often see discussed the most, like with issues or anything just regarding the project? Obviously, HTTP is probably the biggest one, but what are the second and third ones?
Of course, they're really by far the biggest ones. But otherwise, the SSH ones, SFTP, SCP,
right?
FTP still some traffic, and I have users. Still happening on IMAP, SMTP. But then I know we also have occasional reports on RTSP. So there are users of them. And I have this annual survey when I ask users, well, they voluntarily participate, of course. So
Right.
Please help me answer some questions about curl. And every year, all the protocols are selected by more than one user. And I usually get, at least several hundred of responses. So at least every year, at least 3 people marks the checkboxes for all of those protocols, including, RTSP, Gopher, and
I get Gopher, but how is there at least one person that's still looking at Telnet? I want to know what use case that person has for Telnet.
Well,
I really do.
In most cases, what I get to hear about is people saying, well, I use this when I run my pen tests or when I want to do some other. And a lot of people have removed the Telnet clients from their operating systems or whatever. So curl is still there to do the Telnet stuff when you want to run them on some weirdo port to do manual fiddling or whatever. So there's a little bit of that, trying out crazy things that nobody really thought you should do. So. But then, of course, I don't know. I mean, people say that you're using it. Sometimes I suspect that people just say that so that I won't remove them. So, sure, by sympathy. No, keep this. I promise I use this. I have no idea what it is. So I tend to actually check how many users are checking all the protocols, because that seems highly unlikely, right? That someone would say, sure, I used 28 different protocols last year. No way, I don't believe it. But it's actually very rare that someone claims that. So
now, you say that, but I did have someone on here before who because of weird American laws, he owns the telephone lines on his property and has a local dial-up network that he uses to control a local weather system. So you say that's weird, but there are people doing things like that out there. So I'm surely there's someone doing that.
Yes. So yeah, exactly. And when you've shipped something long enough and you have all those weird things, I mean, who knows? There could be 2 people somewhere doing all that. And it's sometimes also I get that question. So, I mean, it's also a matter of counting users, right? I don't really, for me, it's not more work to support something for 2 users than 2 billion users, as long as code is there. As long as someone maintains it, it doesn't matter the number of users. It's still the same code and the same effort. So I don't know. As long as things keep running, it's there, everyone is happy.
That makes sense. As long as it doesn't cause some sort of issue in something else that's more important, it just stays in its own place and does its thing.
Exactly. If it would have gotten in the way for something more important, like sort of if the Gopher code would have been in the way for the HTTP, then we would have gotten rid of it, because I think that's much more important, because that's sort of the main protocol that we do. But it isn't, and we actually have a pretty good architecture in curl so that most of the protocol implementations are off in their own corners, so we don't have to deal with them if we don't deal with that protocol specifically. And most of the transfer engine stuff is a generic thing that just shuffles data in either direction.
Is that architecture something that was thought about like very early on as you got from HTTP to FTP and all of this, or was that something that had to come a bit later when you realized that this was going to become a lot more than just a couple of protocols?
Yeah, it's actually just been a gradual development for a very long time. So no, it started out the most simple, basic way. And I think mostly by accident or by luck, we chose a pretty good API for libcurl when we selected how to do transfers. So we came to pick an arbitration where you don't know a lot of the protocols when you ask for transfers. So you basically say, here's a URL, and then you change behavior with a lot of different options that are not super close to the protocol. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but at least that made it that abstraction layer made it possible for us to actually change quite a lot of internals without changing the externals. And that helped us a lot. So it has been re-architectured and refactored quite a lot of times over the years. So no, it started out really stupid, but we have been able to sort of clean things up pretty. It still has its ugly corners, of course. And I mean, 25, 27 years of code. So, but it's pretty good, I would say.
And I'm sure you've learned a lot about development as you've been going through this project. Like it's not just you knew what you knew then, you still know only that amount. Like you've learned a lot more about how you can structure this code in a way that's going to be useful long into the future.
Exactly. And I really did not know that in the beginning, so I wouldn't have been able to do it. So no, I think I think, I mean, as a developer, I think it's pretty good to just do things that work now and not anticipate so much what happens in 10 years because we don't know. So I think it's been good that way. And of course, I've learned how to do things, and we added protocols that I didn't know about then, and then we sort of realized how to do things. For example, I mentioned I did FTP back in 1997, and FTPs are very different protocols compared to Gopher and HTTP because FTPs are such a back and forth command response. So, you have to do a lot of commands, get response, command response, command response, and then it turns out, I think roughly 10 years later, something 2000, I don't remember, I added support for IMAP, SMTP, and POP3, and they happen to be very FTP-like, right? Okay. And that was an opportunity to, suddenly I had the FTP, and then I added 3 new protocols that were very command response driven, more or less like FTP, but with different commands and different ways to get responsive. But still, so then I, of course, re-architectured that part. So now we have a generic engine to do those back and forth protocols. And so I think it makes sense to re-architecture and handle what's sort of the next workload.
Right.
So what comes at you now, and then we handle it. We actually did a pretty good refactor of curl again late last year when we added support for new protocol stuff. These days we had, we have HTTP3 support since a few years, but the HTTP3 is adding quite a few new challenges, I would say, problems, interesting quirks for someone who's doing internet transfers, because it's done over QUIC, which is done over UDP. So it's a completely different network stack. You don't have that in the kernel. You have a different libraries and stuff. So, opens up a range of new different ways to do things and new paths in the code. So we had a pretty big refactor quite recently to be able to handle all that in a decent fashion.
Are those refactors a relatively common thing, or does it just sort of happen whenever it really needs to happen?
I think, so they happen every once in a while, but so we do them when we sort of eventually we feel that, well, we've sort of come to the end of the road when it comes to handling things this way. We really have to redo something here so that it becomes easier to manage. And maybe, we've added 4 different things, and now someone says we should add a 5th too. So sort of everything, wait a minute, adding the 5th one is just going to break all of this. We have to rethink how we do this and do it in a better way so that we can manage number 5, 6, 7 as well, and so on.
So let's go back a little bit to when you were first getting started. When you were writing curl initially, did you have any sort of formal programming education? Were you self-taught? Like, how did you actually learn to do what you were doing?
So I was already working in full-time as a developer, as a professional. So yes, development has always been my thing. I did it learned as a teenager at home. I was always into programming and development. So yeah, I worked as a developer then. I did my first TCP networking open source that IRC-bot I mentioned before I started curl. So I had a little bit started doing TCP networking stuff open source before that. So, but of course I didn't start it with any anticipation that it would become anything. It was just my little toy to download a few things, and then it just grew a little bit, and people had features, and so it was never. I didn't have any lofty goal or ambitions to do anything major. It just grew gradually, and of course I learned things, and then we did things, and so yeah. I've learned a lot of things, of course, not only in development. I think at some point in time, doing things open source, suddenly you realize that it's not really code or development that is the tricky part. It's the management of the volumes of people and communication and talking about things and information and documentation and all of that. So in the end, so nowadays I would say maybe writing code is the easy part, right? So it's all of the other things to get everyone on board. And all of that.
I did notice you posted recently on Mastodon that you had close to 1,200 total contributors over the years. Obviously, they're not all active contributors, but close to 1,200 people that have contributed something to the project over the years.
Yeah.
How many people do you reckon you have actively working on the project?
So out of those 1,200, whoever committed anything, I actually count contributors too, who actually also reported bugs, and that's number is
okay,
close to 3,000 now. But anyway, so I think there's about 65% of those committers only committed once.
Right.
So that's the first, that's 700 something people who only. So and then I would say that I also have, of course, I like graphs of the project, so I've
I've
noticed
noticed you post them a lot.
So I know that roughly in a year, then people required to do something like 80% of all the commits. It's like 8, 7, 8, 9, 10 persons in the team. So we are that. If I would say how big is the sort of the core team, maybe we are 10, 15. We don't have any. It's not a pronounced team. We're all just here. So I have a bunch of people who have the permission to merge code and do that, but mostly people just hang around, they contribute code when they can, and we hang around. So I don't know really how. We don't have any, explicit core team. It's just people hang around.
No, I sort of meant just people that actively show up. Like, obviously, you're going to have people that pop in just for one thing, but you're going to have people that sort of, they want to make this their, like, main project they focus on helping out.
Yeah. So I would say that's between 10 and 20 people who are actively hanging around. And then, of course, maybe if you say people who show up once a month, I would say maybe that number would be 100 people. So that, I recognize when they come back again. Because there's always those people pretty far away, but repeat contributors. They possibly use curl in maybe their products or some commercial things somewhere, and they show up. You saw them 2 years ago, and now they have patches again. So that's a very long tail of people, of course.
So what do you find to be the... I know you were saying that code's sort of the easiest part now. Like, what do you find to be difficult about managing the human aspect? Is it just dealing, like, different people are going to have different intentions for the project? Is it sort of just dealing with the different ways people communicate with the project?
All of that. The people have different goals, so they all they all want something. They all want curl to work, but they want it to work for their particular purposes, and that's a different kind of important to them. As I said, a lot of people are using curl right in their commercial products, so they are employed by someone who's shipping this in a product. So when they get assigned a thing to fix in curl, they do that for their employer. But for them, it's important to do that. But for me, that's not my main concern, right? If they do the fix in a weird way, I tell that to them. No, we can have that. It should, and of course that's one way to as a problem. And there's this challenge. The regular also just cultural or language and people just, how do you actually say something online? And there's a lot of just abuse because people try to be too short, or I don't know, people are just being very unpleasant at times, and that's kind of annoying and difficult to deal with. Sometimes you can just, of course, dismiss them if they go over a certain line, but sometimes you don't quite understand, is this a cultural thing? Is that maybe just the way you try to articulate right now, or things like that. All the way. And of course the regular thing that is hard sometimes to deliver review comments, just the human side of things. How much can you critique someone's code until they give up and think you're annoying prick? So like all of that, and then the educational part. Did you actually understand what you are trying to do here, right? There's a protocol underneath. It does things on the network, possibly with another server in the other end, right? So you have to follow protocol standards, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's just a lot of humans and a lot of communication and code in there and things to do. And then of course, sticking to his code style and following things. And we think we should write code this way. But maybe they don't think that, or why do you have that weird way of doing code? Why do you insist on short lines when I want to write my lines very long? Why do you insist on anything? So it's all of that.
Do you have
usually it's not a really big problem. More like that's just things to work with all the time.
When you're saying about code styling, do you have a defined style guide for the project, or is it sort of you have just judge it as you go?
We have a pretty now. We actually started out without anything, of course, because
Sure.
we pretty much didn't have anything back in. But over the years, we have sort of gradually become stricter and stricter in many ways. I think I've sort of tried to tighten the bolts and screws everywhere, so it's code style, test cases, documentation, everything has become so nowadays. 20 years ago it was really easy to just add code, just add it, submit it, and we ship it. But nowadays you have to actually follow the style, code style. You have to bring tests, bring the documentation, motivate what you want to do, and explain it to us, and make us sort of buy your proposal, and then you can do it. So yes, we have. But that also comes with me over time realizing the importance of it, or sort of, for example, code style. That might sound silly, but I actually believe in when you can read the code and it actually looks like it's a single author, it's actually helping, because it makes it much easier to understand. And when you do debugging code, reading code, you want it to be a single flow, right? You don't want to have a jump. Wait a minute, what changed here? Different styles of doing things. So I actually think that's a very good way to just make the code easier to read and understand and work with. So that's one reason why I sort of nowadays insist on a very unified code style. But we check all that with tools. So nowadays you get red lines in the CI build. So usually we don't have to point that out as a user.
I'm sure that makes things a lot easier, not having to manually check over styling. Now that everything you just set up your style guide in whatever software you're using, and it just does it for you. And hopefully that means they just give it to you in the correct style guide, in the correct style.
It's easier, and I think it also helps for the human side, because I think the contributors, it's easier for them to take it when there's a tool pointing out the problem,
right?
Rather than a human saying you should remove a white space there. Because I think if humans does it, it's a different sort of, you interface humans differently than you interface just the error output from a tool.
Right. No one's going to complain the compiler is telling them their code's wrong. Like, it's just, the code's wrong, fix it.
Exactly. Then you just, okay, I fix it. Sort of, rather than argue with the tool that the tool is wrong. Yeah.
Now, you might think the compiler's wrong and then try to run it again, it still doesn't work, but,
Yeah, of course. There's always those. No, it must be a compiler bug.
Yeah, for sure. I know I've certainly, I've done that plenty of times myself.
Yeah.
It is always funny when something actually does start working. It's like, wait, what happened there? Did I just forget to save the code or something? Like, there are definitely times when I do think something has gone wrong, but it's just some error that I missed in some of the locations. Like, oh, I tried to recompile the exact same code without saving my changes, and it's just, usually if the compiler says it's wrong, you're actually wrong. So don't argue with it. Just do it.
Yeah.
So, do you find that having these extra restrictions sort of acts as a barrier to entry for bringing people into the project? Or do you find that most people tend to just accept that they are there and then work with them?
I don't think those restrictions are a particularly big sort of hurdle for people to come over. So no, I think we actually we have pretty low bars for people to come into the project. So we try to be as low friction as possible, and sort of stick to the GitHub working model of doing things, pull requests. So you just have to go to GitHub, fork it, make a pull request, and submit it. And we don't have any, you don't have to, there are no paperwork. You don't have to do any agreements. You just submit it and we can accept it. So I think in general, it's low friction. I think what people find harder is when you want to do bigger things, because then we insist on doing, as I mentioned already, test cases and documentation. Right. And that might be a bigger hurdle, because writing test cases and doing that in a way that works everywhere, that might be a bit of a problem. But then you have a bigger motivation too, right? If you want this feature added, then you have to just accept that you need to do it in the proper way. It's more than just bringing the code for the feature. You also have to prove that it works and describe how it works and things like that.
I know there are a lot of projects out there, obviously most notably things like Linux, which have kept using their old model that they've pretty much been using forever. It's like the mailing list model. You send an email in, you get your code reviewed by people there. At what point did you decide to start using the GitHub model?
Well, At some point I did. So we switched to using Git in 2010.
Okay.
And in 2010 was actually already then fairly late. We used CVS before that. But from a curl perspective, that was not a big problem because we've always had a pretty simple way of developing, and linear main branch. It wasn't that hard to use CVS. But at some point we switched to Git, and it's of course a much better tool in many ways. But I think we didn't switch to the GitHub model immediately. We just switched tool first, and then after a while, I just realized that there's so many users with GitHub, and with now switching to that mindset really, or of development. So at some point in time, it's more of a sure, you can keep sending emails. You can still do that. Send an email patch on the emailing list if you prefer that way. But if you ask users these days, that's a minority.
Yeah.
So people don't want to do it. So I ideally wanted to offer either way. You go with the GitHub way, or you send an email. And just over time, it's just apparent that, well, we get an email every third month nowadays with a patch, and we get pull requests many every day. So that's just where people are and how they want to contribute. So that goes with I want to be there where the users are, where the developers are, and I want to have a low friction. So, and to allow them to, if they find a spelling error in the documentation, I want it to be easy for them to just send a correction to me this afternoon without, adding problems or hurdles, or no, you have to send an email formatted correctly. No, you can't use these different emails that you've used your entire life. You have to do it in another way. I think that is, some projects can do that. And always when we compare to the Linux kernel, sure, no one can compare us with them because they're unique. They can set whatever rules they want. Everyone will still.
It's a very special project. Most people are not going to be able to do that.
Exactly, but they can also set whatever rules they want because it doesn't matter. You just have to go there and follow their rules anyway. And I feel that I don't have that because we all have a limited number of contributors out there, right? There are open source people. That bunch can only contribute to so many open source projects. So if you're adding friction and problems to them, maybe they just then I won't do that. I will go to the other project because I had a patch for them as well. So I want it to be easy so that they can submit their patch and continue with their lives.
I do respect what the Linux kernel is doing there. Like they've decided that this is how we're gonna do it, and just basically have stuck to it. Like there's no point changing the model that works. This is just the model. And if you go, I think it also works really well for the kernel because of the fact that it does filter out those people that may not have the best of intentions. Like if you're a project the size of the kernel, there are going to be people that are trying to do things in a malicious way, and it is going to filter out some of those people. Obviously, it does filter out the people who are maybe fairly new to development, who haven't really been introduced to this model before, but in a way, it does help them. But you are definitely right that most projects simply can't do that.
It definitely helps them, but they're also unique in so many other ways, as you say, in the volume, in their so of course they have to do a lot of things to manage the grand scope of the code and the contributors and everything. So I'm sure that doing things my way with their volume, that would break immediately. So of course they have a different situation. So we can't compare like that. I wouldn't dream of comparing myself to that project, but that's huge. I'm just a tiny project in comparison.
Your project, I think you're saying it's past 160,000 lines or something along that?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how many lines are in the kernel at this point. It's a couple million. So it's a little bit smaller.
Yeah, I think there's more than a couple. I think it's more than 10, 20, 30 million.
I haven't checked the number in a while, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's if it's somewhere at that point.
So many magnitudes larger.
And also just the number of commits they have for every single release, like thousands of commits per release.
Yeah. The commit traffic there is insane. So yes, they obviously need to manage that in a completely different way and more streamlined. So I understand that they need different tools, different models, different concepts than we do.
That makes sense. So with curl, how do you handle? So let me think what I'm trying to say. You have the GitHub model as your sort of development model, but how do you handle communication? Or do you have communication outside of that, or is it just communication is done through the issues and merge requests on there? Is there a a separate like IRC, or what do you actually have as the
Yeah,
surrounding
we have
tooling?
an IRC channel, but that's more. There are a few core
Right.
people that hang out. So IRC is still such a niche way to
Sure, sure.
communicate. We have mailing lists because we exist since a long time. So we started out with mailing lists. We have that, and we have nowadays. I would say most communication is done in GitHub issues and GitHub pull requests because of people have problems or propose changes. We also use the GitHub discussions these days. So I would say those are the different channels that people communicate with the project.
So,
And of course, I try to complain, yell at the world through my blog and stuff like that.
yeah. There are definitely some fun posts you made on there for sure. So we'll definitely talk about that in a moment, but nowadays curl runs on pretty much every system you could possibly want it on, even systems that nobody out there is using.
Yes.
But when curl was first getting started, were you developing that on Linux, or was it for something else initially?
It started out before I started using Linux. So
Okay.
I hadn't tried Linux in '96 actually. So it started on some I think Sun OS or Solaris
Okay.
because we had those machines at work, and I started because I ran my cron job at work. So I started out with that, and I already before that had sort of I mentioned my bot, and that was already before that working on Sun OS and Solaris already in a sort of cross-platform way. So I already knew about different Unixes and how to do things to work differently. So already from day one, I wanted it to work and compile on different platforms, and that was also one of the reasons why I already made it open source from day one, because I wanted it to be open so that people could get it to run on their different platforms. But because you remember back in those days, we had a bazillion of different Unixes, so it wasn't obvious then which Unix people were going to use, right? There were so many different ones, and Linux certainly was not an obvious choice in the 90s. It became a more obvious choice as time passed, but
Yep.
so then I switched to Linux as a primary development platform, I think early 2000s or something.
Okay. Oh wow, that's a lot later than I thought it was.
Yeah, I don't remember, but it was something like that.
Right. Okay. Do you remember what you first switched to when you started using Linux?
I think it's Red Hat.
Ah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Some of those early things. I think I started trying it out in it was actually late 90s. I think 99 maybe, because I remember I installed that and run a web server at work.
What do you happen to use nowadays?
Nowadays, I'm sticking to Debian. Debian unstable on most of my machines.
Any particular reason why you've gone down the Debian route, or it just sort of works for you?
I did it a long time ago. I stuck with it. Now I'm familiar, so it works for me. So I'm just not rocking the boat. I'm happy with it. So
no point changing it. It just does what you need to do.
Exactly.
Right. That's totally fair. So at what point did it start working on the Windows side? Do you happen to recall?
Pretty early on, because we shipped it open source from the beginning. I believe already when I called it wget, we had Windows versions of it.
Oh wow!
Built. I mean, I didn't build it, so someone else built it. But I accepted patches, so we had it buildable on Windows from very early on. So I think the first version of curl we shipped, that one built on Windows. So it has always worked on Windows as well.
So how does it feel to know that a project you've written is getting shipped as like a part of Windows now? Like, obviously, you know where we're going with this. We're going to talk about the
Miscellaneous. No, I think it's pretty cool. I mean, it's shipped in with Mac OS forever. So it's been in commercial operating systems since a very long time. So yeah, it's really cool, and I think it's cool to be one of those first true open source components that Microsoft actually sort of incorporated into Windows as a component. So yeah, really cool.
So yeah, you know where we're going with this. We're going to talk about, obviously, why did that? No, don't open on that one. Okay, just open the link on the wrong screen. So the whole Windows people deleting curl from their system, that happened back in April.
Right.
Yeah. That was a situation.
Yes, and I I suspect that might happen again. But so yeah, since so that's part of my entire argument, discussion, fight, combat with NVD, the National
Yeah.
Vulnerability Database. Since when we report security vulnerabilities in curl, which we do at the rate of a few every year, maybe more than a few, a total of 145 now, I think, through the years. So we take that seriously because that's sort of what people expect from us. So people report a security problem, we research it, figure it out, document it, and report it, and there's a CVE ID and a number and blah blah blah. And when we do that, anyone who does that, we submit those CVEs, so they get collected in the database. And NVD is a U.S. government organization that's funded by the U.S. government. That's called National Vulnerability Database, whatever nation that is. I wonder, but
the world nation.
Okay, so anyway, but they import those CVEs that people submit, and they then reevaluate the score, or they set a score for that vulnerability. And that is a fun subject, because who are they to say how important a bug in, for example, curl is? I've documented it. This is what the vulnerability. This is what happens. This is sort of the bug, and here's the fix. So everything is open, right? So if you would like to, you can go and read the code and figure out exactly what the problem is. If you understand C code and want to spend some time on it. So it's not. It doesn't take a genius, but you have to invest some time and have some clues. But I don't think they have that. They might have clues, but I don't think they have the time for this. So they don't really actually investigate the problem. They just put a finger up in the air and say, oh, this is a severity, and they have the CVSS score thing. So yeah, they end up with usually a very inflated score. So in the Windows case then that we talked about this spring, it was a problem. I think I graded it as a low severity thing because it's a use after free.
Yes.
It's a very limited time window, and actually free, and then we use the data. So it was sort of it's a potential security problem, really, really hard for anyone to take advantage of. It will probably maybe cause a crash sometimes. Usually you won't even see that. So okay. But NVD considered that to be I don't remember the grade. They said, I think they said critical first, and they lowered it to a high or whatever. But anyway, they set a score for it. So NVD comes up with, this CV has score and the number, right? And fine, we can just disagree, right? They could set a score, I can set a different score. Who's to say it was right? That would be fine if it wouldn't be the sort of the follow-up is that nowadays there's a lot of these security scanners who are also importing all those CVs into their tools. So now they have a bazillion different CVs, and they scan operating systems for vulnerable components. Who is vulnerable for these different CVs? And they started then to find curl vulnerable for this CVE, rated this high. And a lot of organizations apparently nowadays also then have a contractual obligation to fix all problems that have CVE graded higher than 7, 8, or whatever. And they have they have a contract to say they must fix this problem within this number of days. So sure, now you have, and then when they find curl embedded in Windows, vulnerable to this CVE, very serious one, critical, you have to fix it within 5 days. What do you do as a user? How do you fix it? Well, you can, I guess most of these people, they don't actually call someone at Microsoft.
No.
I don't know if they can or if it's even possible.
Well, especially if you're like an individual user who is running one of these security scanners.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you can do, well, a lot of people did one or two things. A lot of people downloaded curl from us, a new Windows executable, the latest one, and just replaced the one in Windows. So, overrode it with a new one. And some just deleted the one in Windows, which is in, C::win, blah, 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 whatever it is. And just delete it. And the security scanner is happy. Mission complete. Until, of course, a few days later or whatever, when you try to do Windows update. And then it says, nope, I'm not going to update. You have tampered with the Windows installation.
I love Windows. It's great. Like, you know, a Linux system, if you tamper with it, it's like, the file's gone? Okay, whatever. It's fine. It's not my problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, we just
Exactly.
download stuff.
Then you put it back in the next because you get a new version of that. Yeah, but that's not how Windows works, apparently.
So
yeah, so I got quite a few questions and people actually pretty upset about that, but it's because suddenly their Windows updates didn't work. So how do you actually upgrade curl for Windows? And you know that then you end up like me, you end up in a really weird position because I didn't ship that curl to them. They didn't download that curl from us even. They downloaded that as a part of the Windows installation, right? So they got it from Microsoft, who built it, compiled it, and shipped it as part of Windows. It's really part of the Windows.
Did you get bug reports like directly to the curl project during that?
Yes. And also I also got, since I sell curl support, I also got people trying to buy help from me to solve that. But I mean, I couldn't, it's not that easy to fix because it's not our problem, right? It's a problem with that user and their Windows installations. It's not, yeah.
What I found kind of the worst part about that was when people were going to places like microsoftanswers.com, and there were people who were like marked as like official help there who were suggesting deleting it.
Yes, exactly.
It's one thing if you go to Reddit and there's some just random person tells you. When you are marked as like the official help guy and your advice is tamper with the Windows system, which is going to break the updates, like that's not good advice.
No, that's really horrible. So of course that is totally, I mean, a good explanation why people would do it, right? It says so on the Microsoft site. That's the solution. So I mean, that's not even, I mean, of course you would do that if it says so on their site and it seems to be a trustworthy person who is sort of, So yeah, they kind of led the users into that trap, and then bam, now you're in deep doo-doo.
And I did notice there was a more recent one you talked about in your blog, the CVE 2020 19909.
Yes.
So what's I didn't actually read the blog. I like briefly skimmed over it, but what's the deal with this one? Because that's a CVE from 3 years ago, judging by the number on
it. This is a totally different level of crap, really, because this is multi-layer stupidity. So I mean, and I don't mean to say that I'm unique here either. This is not the first time it happens. This is just a sort of a sign of the CVE system being a rather flawed system. So basically, CVE is a way to, this is a bug tracker ID. So anyone can submit a CVE or create a CVE ID. It's just submit it and say, here's a bug in this product, blah blah blah, and someone then did that, and this is an old bug from 2019.
Right.
It was actually a bug. Someone actually reported as a security problem back then. I dismissed it because it's not a security problem. It's an integer overflow. So it makes curl misbehave. So it's a fun overflow too because it's in the retry option. So if you say retry in 9 bazillion years, and so instead of retrying in a 9 bazillion years, it's actually wraps around. It becomes 12 seconds instead.
Right.
But it's a highly unlikely scenario to actually happen because who is going to use that? Apart from so I determined this is a bug because it wraps and it behaves stupid. So it's a bug. I fixed it.
But there's nothing like security related.
3 years later, someone created a CVE for this, and it ended up in the NVD database again. And what do? They set a score, and do they check it out? As I said before, they probably don't have the knowledge and skill. And in this case, they probably just roll a dice or they just pick the default value or whatever. They said 9.8 critical, which is 9.8 out of 10. That has to be a pretty nasty bug, right?
Yeah.
Instead of that wraparound for the retry time, so they could actually retry in 12 seconds instead of at the end of the universe. So now there's this totally bogus CVE said to be 9.8, and it's not even a bug. And we fixed it 3 years ago. It's totally silly. And then nowadays, of course, that bug now appears everywhere because everyone is adapting to those new CVEs that pop out. So now everyone has to say if their operating system is vulnerable to this security flaw or not. But this is not really. This is just a stupid thing. So I've of course tried to reject this now in the database, but it's a slow process, and I'm it's much harder to take it away than for someone to put it there. So I would say it's a sign of a rather non-optimal system for doing these things.
I wasn't aware that just anybody could submit a CV in that way. I thought there was like some sort of, I don't know, some sort of oversight in that regard.
Yeah, I'm telling you now, I'm opening the Pandora's box. No, it's actually slightly more complicated than so, because there's also a way to just make it slightly more complicated. So when you ask for one of these CVEs, an ID, there are hundreds of different organizations that work on giving them out. So that, it's a distributed system. So you one of those that you ask for. So and what those they're called CNA, number authority. CVE numbering authorities, I think. They can actually lock down and say only this authority can give out numbers for that particular product. So you can actually have a particular authority. So then you can actually limit how much. So that's why you cannot just get a CVE on any known brand product you can think of, because then they will say, oh, well, you have to talk to this CNA, and they will. So if you make that up, they will say, no, this is a bogus. We won't give you one. So there is some kind of system in place, but that system just protects a certain subset of products. I don't have a product that is protected this way by any CNA. So you can, for our products, anyone can create a CVE at any time.
It seems like I was just having a look at the CVE now. It seems like there has been some update here. It is now marked as disputed and links to your blog post about it. So it seems like
that's good.
It seems like there's been some effect there, which is good. It's still marked as 9.8 critical, but it's at least got disputed there. So there's something.
That is good. That is good. Yeah. So since I've had this, I have this conversation with NVD. So I've been I think they've inflated the scores on our CVs many times. So I tend to email them every now and then. So I emailed them about this as well. So I've sort of said, this is completely wrong. You should just mark it somehow, remove it ideally. And they are MITRE.org is the organization that actually hosts the sort of this source database. So now I have asked for it to be rejected there as well. So ideally, hopefully, at some point, someone will say, yes, it's silly, we remove it. But I think also my blog post actually sort of got noticed quite. I noticed that the Ubuntu one also says now it's disputed and links to my.
It says this CVE is not a security issue, and the curl author intends on disputing the CVE, marking as not affected. Priority low.
So there's hope that there's going to be some level of sanity, at least.
Surely, if you just complain to them enough, they will eventually fix the system.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're gonna write the exact same blog post 3 months from now. I guarantee it.
I fear that, but I also have some other plans in motion to address this in a wider and in a better way too. So actually, I'm probably going to apply to become a CNA myself.
Okay.
For the curl organization in that way, because then I can, as I mentioned, limit that scope so that I can limit who can submit CVs for our products, and also hopefully reduce the rescoring that NVD does on the issue. So hopefully that action can fix both of those. I think it's a bit sad that I need to go that path, because it doesn't seem like a scalable way, because certainly not the entire world can solve it like this.
Yeah.
But I'm trying the best I can to solve my issues, at least.
I'm sure it's not just an issue in regards to your project. This is like a widespread thing with CVEs.
Absolutely, exactly. So it happens all the time.
Is becoming a CNA like a massive undertaking? Like, just doing it in regards to your project?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'm only in the beginning, so
sure.
I'm not the right guy to ask. So ask me again in a few months.
From what you've done so far, does it seem like it's going to be like this? At least from what you've looked at it, like, does it seem like it's going to be a massive deal?
Exactly. So since my scope is limited, so it seems to be a rather limited amount of effort and energy to waste on this, and there's no fees and there's no contracts
well, that's good.
and stuff like that. So it seems to be decently a pretty good way to do it, I hope.
Right. Okay, so then if that does happen, then you are basically like the people can then come to you and be like, hey, there's a problem here, but you are the sort of the single source of truth on whether there are these vulnerabilities. Is that understanding correctly?
Exactly. Exactly.
Right, that makes sense. So hopefully then,
So hopefully, exactly, that will hopefully prevent me from writing the same blog post in 3 months. It'll be slightly different instead.
Well, that would definitely be good, because I know, I feel like I've read that blog post a couple of times. It's just gotten gradually more and more and more annoyed with NVD.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel that way as well. It feels like, well, wait a minute, didn't I already have this problem? But it's so variations of the same issue.
When do you feel like this first became a problem for you? Because obviously there was a point where there wasn't really any tension in that CVE way, but at what point did you start realizing maybe there was a bit of a problem?
I think it started to become a problem when people actually put some weight to these scores they put on the issues, because previously I've never bothered about them setting whatever. It doesn't matter to me if they set 9 or 4 or 7. I don't care. I've always sort of put an honor on documenting our stuff properly and well, and well reasoned, and sort of argue this is how we grade it. And I think that is the sort of the canonical truth, if you will, about our problems. And then I haven't really cared about what they then think about it, because everyone can have their own opinion. But now when everyone puts so much importance to their scores, suddenly it makes a much big of a difference, because now when they put such a high scores and people take that so seriously, and they run into problems and they come back to us, so we sort of have to spend time and effort on those problems caused by them inflating the scores. That's when I think it starts affecting us in a much more negative way. And that's the time when I start sort of say, hey, why are you doing this? Because it affects us in a negative way.
Right. Okay. So it's sort of just, now that you have these security scanners everywhere, now that organizations do take it as a big deal, it's now become more of a problem that you need to actually do something about.
Exactly.
Right. That makes sense. So I hear beeping again. I don't know where that beeping. It was slightly in the background. I don't know what that. I'm sure there's something weird going on with either Jitsi or with I don't know, because that came back a little bit.
I cannot hear any beeping here, at least.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal is there. I doubt, maybe I'm just hearing things. That's entirely possible, and people are going to listen to the recording and they will notice absolutely nothing. But I hope
raise the volume to max now and listen for the beep in the background. Is it there or isn't it?
It just came back for a moment. It's not been there the entire time. Whatever. Whatever. Doesn't really matter. So actually, where can we go from here? So, what we can talk about? We can talk about what you're involved in besides curl. Obviously, curl is your main focus, but there are other projects that are related to curl that you get involved with as well.
Yes. So yeah, I work full time with curl, and curl really is my big thing since forever, as I said. So, and during the development of curl, actually, many years ago, I also started out actually when I wanted to do proper asynchronous name resolving in curl, and then I sort of joined and then forked and became the maintainer of the project that nowadays is called CARES, which is an asynchronous DNS library for name resolves and DNS operations. So that is a library that also keeps living. I'm a nowadays a less active maintainer of that project, but it's still there, still used quite a lot, in a lot of big places. So that is one of those libraries. curl can still use CARES for name resolving. And a few years after that, I added support for SCP and SFTP, right? And that's based on the libssh2 project that I also became a maintainer of. See a pattern here. When the maintainer had to step away, so I was the head maintainer of that for many years. I don't do a lot of maintaining that now either. But those are two libraries that I'm still there in the shadows, and I do releases in those projects. So in that aspect, I've tried to work with projects that I use in curl to make curl a better product.
Right.
And for example, and this year I started a new project called TrueRel, which is just a new command line tool for URL manipulations, really. URL parsing, URL manipulation, because it's more of a companion tool to curl, really. If you want to work more with URLs, like in shell scripts, and extract host names, pass query parts from URLs in shell scripts, or create URLs in different ways. Pretty much because it's a use case that people have ran into in many cases when they have written scripts and stuff with curl.
Right.
But it wasn't really a thing for curl to do. So then I did add this. And it actually uses libcurl for the URL parsing things.
Okay. So sort of all of these tooling, like that tooling obviously relies on libcurl, but then your other tooling sort of builds into curl as well to make it all sort of pieced together, and sort of it helps you out along the way. It's not just you're just doing random other things because you just feel like it.
No, so most of my other things have been like that, to sort of support curl in different ways. I mean, I've done other things as well, but these are the ones that have survived the most and have the most footprint today.
So at what point did you realize that going full-time with curl was actually going to be possible?
Yeah, I didn't. I never really realized that. Well, since it was my spare time project for so long, and I started working for Mozilla in 2014. I want to say, yeah, I think so. Started 2014, and then I worked with HTTP and stuff in Firefox, and quite of a big overlap with the curl stuff because it's HTTP networking, so stuff I knew, stuff I was familiar with, was fun. And then I left Mozilla at the end of 2018 after about 5 years. And at that point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know that I was going to be able to work on curl full time or anything. It felt like it was a good time to try it. And I talked to my friends who work at this company called Wolf SSL, who I work for now, and they basically said, "Sure, we want to do this with you, and so you come work for us. You get a paycheck from the first day, and we sell support to customers. We do it like this." And Wolf SSL already sells support like this for a bunch of other libraries that they host, also open source stuff. So they basically have the business set up for this kind of business support contracts with commercial customers for open source libraries. So it was a really good fit for me, and they were willing to take the risk that we wouldn't find any customers. And then so it was pretty easy to just jump and try it out and see, does it work? Maybe it doesn't. So I just did it, and they sort of believed in this, and since then we're doing it.
That's awesome. It's great that you've. And obviously curl, by that point, curl was already a tool that sort of everybody had some sort of usage for, but I guess you just weren't really sure, if there was going to be that commercial requirement for support there, because obviously it's in every Linux system, but whether there was additional support there that was desired was unclear.
Yeah, and I always struggle with that. How to take that first step, right? How do you at day one actually offer commercial support? It's really hard. You have a lot of systems set up to deal with support issues. You have to have someone write contracts. You have to do all of that. And how do you do that as a single person? It's really hard to just scale that up one day, or at least I struggled with how to do that. So when Wolf SSL said that, sure, we can do it like this, it solved that problem. And then of course I still actually struggle with that thing that, as you mentioned, curl already existed, curl already works, curl is already a solid, stable product. So I always have that struggle when I talk to customers, right? It's already working, it's already finished, we don't have any problems. We don't need to pay anyone any support because they've used this for 10 years already and never had a problem. So tell me again, why are we going to pay you anything at all for this? You gave it away. So of course, it's that struggle too.
So what then goes into the commercial support?
Usually it is the most of my commercial support actually start with them finding a problem. So usually it is that they actually fall into pit somewhere and then want to help with that, and then they realize that it's pretty good to have that relationship. So when they have a problem, I can fix it in much shorter time. So it's guaranteed response time and a communication and a little bit of a hand holding and helping them with questions and stuff like that. So that's the normal just support thing. But there's also a decent business in expanding things. People fall into, well, we'll miss this particular little feature around this, so maybe you can do that, and then we can do that as just contracting around it, which in addition to the support.
So you get more options in curl.
Yes, and usually then also just a completely open source. So contract customers, they pay us to do something, and then it ends up in the open source version, and everyone can use it. So win for everyone.
Well, yeah, that is the nice thing about doing everything in this open source way. Like, you're getting paid to basically help everybody receive this feature for free, even if it's not something that most people are going to be using. Like, there might, like those weird people out there that mark yes on every single protocol. Like, there are going to be someone else out there that probably needs this feature as well. So, like, it's great that, like, this whole idea of open source does exist.
Right. And in many cases, people don't actually know today that they will actually use this in 5 years, right? So the company that pays for something, I add it today, and people today say, wait, why are you adding that now? Because, I mean, who's going to use that? But it's something that, we're going to switch over to, and in the future, we are all going to do that way, because that's the way we are going. So it's a lot of that too, that we don't really know, or most people don't really keep track of what we are using today or what we are going to use tomorrow, right? So who knows where we're, and one of these days you just end up in a situation, now I need to use this, obviously, because I noticed that the browsers are doing something, right? And then you want to do this with a tool, which tool is going to support that? And then it's a really good thing when we already had that support, because someone paid us to do that 3 years ago.
So one thing I did see you talk about the other day, I kind of have to scroll through your Mastodon, because you're posting a Mastodon more than I do. I don't know how you have time to post a Mastodon as much as you do. But I did see you post this, I guess it's a slide of people sort of discrediting a lot of the work that curl has done. Like, you're like, I could write curl in a weekend. Like,
yes, yeah. I collect some of them, some screenshots of them. I think it goes back to the sort of notion people actually think that some of the network stuff is so easy, and I mean, it looks so easy at times, and it's often actually also easy to do it in a half-broken way that works most of the time against your particular server in a controlled way, right? So, I mean, as I said, the first version of HTTP GET, that was just a few hundred lines of code, and it actually downloaded HTTP fine, right? So,
well, I'm sure, copying that would probably take a weekend to do.
Exactly, and I think that is the mindset with so many people. So sure, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to write those 100 lines of code. You can do that in a weekend. Sure, everyone can do that, and actually, sure, can do that, but that is not really what curl is, and I think people have a hard time sometimes to grasp exactly what it means to be curl.
Yeah, my favorite one is the one you put in the middle. I think you can replace 99% of the uses of curl, download one file via HTTPS with like 100 lines of Python or Rust or Go. It's not critical infrastructure in the same way that OpenSSL or LLVM or WebKit is. Like, yeah, you could replace downloading a file with 100 lines of Python script, but
yes,
like, what about the rest of it that it does?
Yeah, and there's such a stupid comment, because you would use that, but how would that download it? It would still be a library in there that would download HTTP, right? So someone would still have written that anyway. So so and in many cases they would end up using libcurl anyway, and somewhere below there, right? So so of course I also get that quite a lot, I think, because from the outside, it doesn't look that complicated, and it looks the same as it has looked like forever.
Mm-hmm.
And a very common comment is that I used curl 10 years ago and I used it yesterday and didn't spot this. There's no difference. I used it exactly the same way. It looks the same way, behaves the same way. So what did you actually do with the last 10 years? So sort of, you work full time on this and it's exactly the same.
Well, that's sort of the thing you're trying to go for. Like, as you said, you're not trying to break old use cases, so it should look the same that it looked 10 years ago. Like, that's the point.
Exactly. That is sure. You notice exactly, and that takes quite a lot of effort to make sure that it actually looks and works exactly the same. So, but it's when you're sort of, if you don't think about it properly, it might look easy or stupid or I don't know.
Well, it's also really easy to. This is why I like to bring developers onto this podcast. It's really easy to criticize a project when you don't really know the person behind it. Like, you look at the project as this giant block of code. It's like, this is a thing. It doesn't matter who made it. It's just, this is a thing that exists, and ignore all of the effort that's gone into that over the years, making sure the test case is there, making sure the documentation is there, making sure that all of this fits together in a way that makes sense and doesn't unnecessarily introduce security vulnerabilities. Like, dealing with all of this stuff, like, someone has to do that. It's not just magically appearing. And I think a lot of people tend to forget that there are these people that work in the open source space that do spend a lot of time working on these projects that sort of, I guess, yeah, a lot of people just ignore that the human aspect entirely.
Yeah, and the time it takes to mature, and sort of, I often try to come back to that the sort of one of the biggest competitive advantages curl has is the time we have sort of been out there. So, I mean, if you want to compete with curl, sure, you can write a replacement, but can you write a replacement that has, proven itself for 2 decades already without a breaking functionality? That is some of the powers with curl. Not that it actually works today, and because you can write something that seems to work today, that's easy. But keep working the same way 15 years from now. That is harder. That is a lot of work.
Well, what also helps now with making a copy of curl is that curl has come up with this model that works. So it's not like you're going from where you were back in 1996, where you didn't know what you were doing. Like, curl is there. If someone wants to copy it, like, they can do it. They can use it as a reference.
Yeah, that is so true. Because sometimes also people seem to think that where we are now is sort of, it's natural that we ended up here, right? Look back from 96 to here. Of course, this is where we ended up, but it was never. I mean, why would we end up with this? It's every single thing we do, right? It's a decision. Should we do it that way? Should we go that way? Is this the right thing? Is this the wrong thing? Should we do this? Should we do that? And every little decision we do, and building things in a particular direction, brick after brick after brick, and then eventually today we have this. So sure, you're completely right. So replicating or reproducing, writing your replacement today, that would be much easier because we've already showed how this is how you can do it. So if you want to do replacement, this is sort of one way to mimic it. Of course, much faster than all the wrong turns we have taken through the times, or as we've talked about, re-architectures and refactors numerous times because we came up with things that, oh, wait a minute, we didn't think about this before, and now we have to do it this way. So of course it takes a lot of that. But ideally also we are actually underneath the surface actually pretty well suited for what possibly comes next as well, right? Because we've done this so many times already. We know that down the road, around the next corner, there's going to be new protocols. There's going to be new versions of every little subcomponent in here coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but they're coming. And then we know that we're going to have to add support for them, and we know how to do that. And adding more combinations into this lovely mess of different protocols and versions.
As you've been adding these protocols over the years, which protocol did you find was the hardest to work with? Oh, maybe that's... Obviously, the first one would have been like the one you sort of weren't really sure about how to do, but I guess besides the very first thing you did, like what have you found to be sort of difficult to add over the years?
Well, I mean, HTTP is by far most complicated and the biggest one in curl. So I think that is we always come back to that anyway. And also we have so many different versions, and versions that are so different from each other. So we have HTTP 1, 2, and 3, and they are so different. So sure, they might look different. It was the same on the outside, but they're so different on the inside. So we have a lot of different libraries, a lot of different handling, and fallbacks and different code paths, and a lot of these legacy too, since it was created in the 90s, right? And we did a lot of things differently then, but we still did things, and we have that around still. So it's a lot of that. So just all the bulk for HTTP, all the different versions of FTP and proxies and authentication and down to cookies and all of that. So yeah, it's super complicated. If we would cut out HTTP from curl, there's not a lot left. The other ones are very simple in comparison. Well, maybe I should possibly say then that other stuff like TLS is probably also complicated, but from our point of view, it's not, because we use libraries for that. So we don't implement TLS ourselves, for example. So therefore, I don't include TLS it's not in my scope. So
that's someone else's problem to deal with.
Exactly. So I don't include that when I think about complication.
If you had to just guess off the top of your head, how much of the code base is dedicated to just getting HTTP working?
It's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, so much. I said the 160K lines of code, but that's also because we have so many different backends for different things. So that also adds up a lot of code that is not used at the same time. For example, we support now, I think it's 12 different TLS libraries, but you usually just go with one of them, right? So So we have a lot of code, right? But you just go with one of those TLS libraries. So
I guess you would have different backends to different operating systems. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and different alternatives on many of them as well. So and therefore, and we have different HTTP3 backends, we have different SSH backends, we have different name resolving backends. So that means that you pick and choose a lot. So that's also why there's the total amount of code is under the 60K, but you never build all of that in a single build. You're probably less than 100K once you go to a particular huge build yourself. So maybe out of that for HTTP, it's going to be, I don't know, 40K, 50K, I don't know.
So right now, obviously, you probably would be working on it if this is the case. What do you find right now is an area where curl is lacking? Like, is there anything where you feel like maybe it needs to be cleaned up, maybe there needs to be some additional functionality there, or do you feel like right now curl is in a really good state and it's just adding things as they come up?
Well, I think curl is covering a lot of what I think it should cover. It covers really well and in a good way. So I think it has a pretty good coverage of a lot of the protocols that I mentioned. So I think it's most of the stuff is just there, right? So I think what we mostly adapt to is new edge cases and things sort of changing. As in coming now, for example, is I mentioned HTTP3, so we still only have that experimental. So so we don't even have that enabled by default. So that's one of the things that's sort of going to change things. But then around the corner is, for example, adding new things to do proxying over HTTP3, and then you can do HTTP3 over the older HTTP protocols. So you can proxy HTTP3 through H1 and H2 proxies and things like that. So we don't have that today. So we sort of, that's not included in the coverage. But sort of when we sort of add on, users are going to start doing new things outside of what curl does today, and then we're going to see maybe, well, that curl is lacking in that area, so then we're going to spot those things that curl can't do that. And I think we see that happening when we do things, when we change networking or how we do networking in general. IETF invents new things, the browsers follow and do new things. Now we can do, like, for example, when I still was working for Mozilla, we did DNS over HTTPS, right? There was sort of, now suddenly we opened up entirely new way to do name resolving over HTTPS instead of just over UDP as we had done before. Suddenly the browsers were doing that, and whoa, curl didn't do that. So suddenly curl could do everything you could do with the browser, but suddenly there was this thing that curl could not do that you could do with the browsers, and people started doing. So then it was suddenly an area that, hey, here's something we should just add to curl so that we can keep up and offer that feature as well. So I think it's a lot of that. So we cover most of it, and then something changes and it opens up an area where we don't, or people fall into a weird combination of things that, hey, it turns out that you can't do FTP with a SOX proxy and do stuff like that.
Okay. So one thing I want to talk about is the governance of curl. So curl, it's, at least on the website, it says that it sort of follows a BDFL style project. Right now, obviously, you're very much like involved in the project, but do you ever see a time where you would willingly step away? Obviously, there might be health concerns that come up at some point, but do you see a point where you would ever just want to let someone take over just because you feel like stepping away?
Sure. Or rather, I don't see that coming in the near term, but I do lay out things. I try to work in the project so that we can manage that point in time whenever that comes, voluntarily or not. So yeah, I actually try to work really hard on making sure that everything is done in the open, everything is done with a team, everything is sort of documented in procedures and things, how we do releases, how we do handle security stuff, how we do whatever, so that there's not too many weird secrets just in my head. So if I go on a vacation tomorrow, the ones who are still in the teams who have the sort of the right credentials, they can just step up and do the things without me if they want to.
I want to bring this up because of the recent situation with Bram Molinar, and the Vim project is in a state where they're not entirely sure what's going to happen. Like, there are people in place that can maintain the project, but nobody really has the vision that Bram had. Like, he's got things laid out, but there was a lot of stuff going on that's just in Bram's head that nobody's entirely sure how they're going to implement, or if there's really a way to implement it.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine that, but then so yeah, I don't think I have so much sort of vision outline. So if I sort of would go away, people wouldn't really know what I have anticipated to do the coming year. But I don't think that is a problem. I would also say that sort of if I would go on vacation tomorrow and say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, you go ahead and do it, I would rather that people that step up sort of did that thinking instead of following what I had in mind, because someone who leads the project, who wants to drive it somewhere, should drive it where they think it should go. So I don't think anyone would actually need sort of my roadmap for the next year if I would go away.
Well,
I think we have a pretty good track record. We have a direction. We have a general way of doing things. I think people could, if I would leave and people think that sure, it was a good way how we did it in the past, we could sort of quite easily just follow the same sort of trajectory going forward, or they could determine that it wasn't really good, we could do it in a different way. I don't think that should be a problem. I want to make sure that there's no secrets and there's no hidden things anywhere that would make people not know how to do things, how to find things, how to learn things. So the soft things like direction, guidance, vision, sure, I leave that to the afterworld to figure that out. I don't want to impose my. I'm not sure that would work anyway. So, and I don't work that way myself either. I don't have a very strong idea of what to do the next year. I live very much, looking at my feet and doing things immediately next to me. So I don't really have a vision for the long-term future anyway. So I couldn't write it down anyway if I wanted to.
Well, curl's also a very different kind of project. You've got this idea of, you're getting and you're getting and sending data over protocols. It's not like, hey, we have this text editor. It's like, oh, we're adding this Vim script, and we want to have Vim script be the certain style of it's like there is a very different kind of appeal to what Vim was. Like, Vim was Bram's opinionated version of Vi, whereas curl is this very clear, we are doing this thing where we're, operating over web protocols, it doesn't entirely matter how it's done in the backend, as long as, like, to the user, like, you're able to operate over these protocols.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess that answers it pretty well. Because, you know, there is always this concern with projects that are, like, in the BDFL style of something happening, like, at some point in the future. Obviously, there was the case a couple of years back where Python changed from being a BDFL to being a more...
Right.
I don't know what they call it now. It's like a community board, something along those lines, where the previous BDFL is now still involved in the management, but isn't taking over that BDFL position anymore. And then obviously you have the Linux kernel, where, you know, that's, like, still very much BDFL, but Linus has also stepped away from the project in the past, so they do know what's going to happen when Linus eventually does have to step away. Like, it's very clear that Greg is the next person in line. He will then take over, and pretty much nothing will change at that point, because he's already been in that position where Linus has had to step away in the past, and pretty much just the project kept going the same way it's always been going. Like, there's already those protocols in place to know exactly what to do then.
Yeah.
So,
but I think it could work the same way for us too. If I didn't do it, someone else could do it. I mean, other people are already, you know, merging code. I think I still do it at a much higher pace than anyone else, but I'm also the only one who works at it full time. So I compete differently than all the others. So if I wouldn't do it, it would be a completely different situation than others would have to step up and do it instead.
Yeah, so if it was still like a side project, obviously your amount of committing would be nowhere near the level it is today.
Right.
I don't think there's anything else that important I want to address. I think we talked about pretty much everything. Unless there's anything else sort of on the top of your mind you want to talk about?
We covered a lot, I think. I don't know. There's so much to say, but I think we did a good job at talking about a lot of different things so far.
Well, yeah, we're closing in on the 2-hour mark.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. I definitely enjoyed talking to you as well. Like, this has been a lot of fun, and I hope the people got something out of this. Maybe they didn't know about the history of curl or anything like that. I hope people got something out of it at least. If not, I guess, I don't know, leave me an angry comment.
Exactly.
So, I guess let people know where they can get involved with the curl project, how they can find your stuff, or anything you want to direct people to.
Well, to get involved with the curl project, you just go to curl.se and everything is there. We have most of everything documented, so even getting started and known bugs or whatever you want to do. I always try to encourage people to work on whatever they feel is fun first. If you think something is fun, or if you find a problem, fix that and send us a pull request. Otherwise, I'm of course at Mastodon at Bagder, the wrong spelled animal, at Mastodon Social. Otherwise, I blog and yell at NVD every once in a while, and even other blog posts at daniel.hacks.se, haxx.se.
And just scrolling through your Mastodon, I noticed you had like at least 3 or 4 talks, like just listed random. Like you seem to go out of your way a lot to talk about what's going on with curl.
I do. I do that a lot. I try to talk a lot about what's happening in curl. I try to involve people. So I also often sort of enjoy and say, so, you know, when we have a pull request for something weird, maybe a proposal, I try to sort of sometimes post on Mastodon about that, just to make, if you happen to be interested in this weird topic, sort of you can read about it, or you can state your opinion, or just scroll past. So I try to do that so that people can follow and see what's happening. If they want to, they can ignore it if they want to. But I think, you know, the information part is very, really important too, that people see that things are happening and they can speak up if, you know, oh, wait a minute, why are you doing that silly thing? I tried that last year, don't do it. Or great, do that. And have you thought about doing it this? It's much better to do it this way. That kind of, and also, just informing, now we're adding this weird option 257, we're adding this cool thing. You should know about it because you want to use it in the future. So and things like that. So just want to make sure that people are aware of both the development part and the new things that we use, because I think it's fun.
Yeah, I do find that a lot of projects really struggle to get that information out there. Like they have their blog posts like on their website, they have their issue tracker, they have their merge requests, but sort of that's all going to be great for people already involved. But if you're someone who happens to just use the project and don't keep a close eye on it, or you happen to be someone who's maybe wants to find something to get involved in, having that sort of outreach does make it a lot easier to get people at least somewhat interested.
Right. And I think for it to be really successful, you have to sort of hit all of those different sub areas of the project, right? You have to talk with your core people you talk to every day. They have to be in it, they have to know it, but you also have to distribute the knowledge in other ways to people who they don't follow the Git commits because they don't care, but they might care about something else that you did and stuff like that. So therefore I try to do all of those different ways. I do videos about new features. I do, post silly things on Mastodon, and I do blog posts. So I try to hit a little differently depending on different things. So it could be technical stuff about protocols. It could be APIs in the library. It could be command line options, and it could even be how to use old command line options we've had for 10 years, but people tend to abuse or misunderstand. And I try to, write, this is how I think it should be done. Really, this is how we anticipated it, at least, and things like that, so that it could at least find an audience. It's really hard, it's so much information and stuff out there. So how do you actually get people to see things? I don't know.
Well, it seems like you're doing, you're doing something is better than doing nothing. Like,
yes, I think so too.
Is there any other place? So you mentioned the curl website, you mentioned your blog. Is there anything else you want to direct people to?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. I guess I'll do my outro then. So go check out the main channel. That is Brody Robertson. I do Linux videos there 6-ish days a week. I also have the gaming channel. Right now, I'm probably playing through Final Fantasy 16 and Armored Core 6. Maybe. I might be playing something else. I don't know. That's Brody on Games on YouTube and Twitch. If you are watching the video version of this, you can find the audio version on basically any podcast platform. There is an RSS feed. Stick in your favorite app. If you're watching if you're listening to the audio version, you want to find the video version, that is on YouTube at Tech Over Tea. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. I didn't think I would ever have someone who has made a project as important as yours on here. Like that, that's just awesome. I'm very happy to the, who was it? I need to thank whoever got us in contact. What was his name? Who was that?
I forgot.
Aloni Zero over on Mastodon. Thank you. I wouldn't have ever thought to try to get in contact with Daniel otherwise. So thank you for doing this. Like it's absolutely awesome that you did.
It was.
So I'll give you the final word. What do you want to say? How do you want to end it?
I don't want to end it. No, I don't have any final words. Just curl it.
Curl it. Sure. See you guys later.